So, hi there, everyone. Hope you're doing okay. This is a paper that I should have presented at a conference in Berlin on Yugoslav history and global perspective. The conference was cancelled the day before. It should have happened, but I was already in Berlin. I'm going to read the paper, or bits of it, and it's really about Yugocentrism and the study of the non-aligned movement. And it starts with a gratuitous dig at some historians of Yugoslav history and of the non-aligned movement who are very atheoretical, and also have what I would call a fascination with or fetishization of the archive. It's a bit like ethnography for anthropologists, it seems to me. And of course, from my perspective, there can be no history without theory. And if the archive speaks, it's always in need of translation. And there's this lovely, online collaboration from Bandung to Berlin, where they argue within a series of what ifs. What if the Berlin Wall hadn't fallen is the biggest what if. But they argue, quotes, through archives, the past is reshaped, reinterpreted, and even reinvented. The archive is a utopian or dystopian site of knowledge, an imagined junction where identities, memories, values, and beliefs are contested. So the interest in recent years among scholars in the non-aligned movement as a kind of alter or prior globalization reflects, I think, precisely this sense of contested memories. Of course, a lot of the work treats NAM as a top-down interstate initiative. Augustin Koszowski's abstract for the workshop talks of classic accounts of Tito's travels and NAM conferences, but there's also growing interest in the non-aligned movement as a space for meaningful transnational exchanges in the realms of art, science and culture, architecture and industry. NAM can be seen, I think, as a prefigurative post-national configuration, an imagined network community, both transgressing the spatial order of nation states, but also in many ways reproducing a nation state logic. In the 60s, and I think particularly in the 70s, NAM becomes a litmus test for the changing social, spatial and political contours of resistance from the global south, albeit with many contradictions, silences and erasures. And as many people have argued, it's not just about east-west divisions during the Cold War, but of north-south contestations, which in the 70s became particularly important. So what I want to do is try to challenge Yugocentrism. What are some of the issues if the focus on NAM is based exclusively on primarily on socialist Yugoslav sources, as my own work is? So this is very much a kind of mea culpa. And what might some of the strategies and tactics be to overcome the problems of what I'm going to, perhaps controversially, call Yugocentrism? It's a term that hardly appears in the academic literature, at least in the academic literature that I could find. It's more often tied to what Svetlana Boym would call ironic nostalgia, the displacement of a mythical place that can be remembered, but probably not rebuilt. It's used in an online interview by the Berlin-based art historian Bojana Page, and you can see the full quote here. "We were very Yugocentric, as I like to call it. We thought we were the center of the world because we had important foreign politics. We had a lot of contacts with Africa, India, and other developing parts of the world. Our opinion really was that we were the center of the world. After all, we were modern. We had modern socialism and modern art." Of course, it's precisely this invocation of the M word, modern, as if advancing to a singular modernity along a slippery slope, that appears so deeply troubling from a post-colonial theoretical vantage point today. Contrast that with Bojana Videkanich's excellent use of the idea of multiple modernities in their recent book. In strictly social scientific terms, of course, Yugocentrism at least in terms of knowledge production, is not the equivalent of Eurocentrism. I take Eurocentrism here as a shorthand term for the belief that amongst the intersecting dualisms of West-East and North-South, it's the global Northwest that has a monopoly on, or at least a prior claim to, theory that portends or pretends to be universal. Modernity and the Enlightenment, M&E, are presented as twin gifts to the world, ignoring, as Jean and John Komaroff would have it, both their code constitution in and tangible violence and erasure of the colonized. Now, in a different paper, it might be worth speculating on the nature and limits of knowledge making from socialist Yugoslavia. Indeed, both Kardelja, in his readings of non-alignment, reliant on Marx and Lenin and seemingly oblivious to Gandhi, Fanon, and Nkrumah, Cabral, and others, as well as the Praxis School, indifferent to and silent on non-alignment in their presentation of Hegel through a Frankfurt School lens, the Praxis Group, could be seen as prototypical in this sense. Beyond the rather idealized concept of exceptionalism, theorizing the positionality of socialist Yugoslavia in relation to the so-called first, second, and third worlds was and remains rather haphazard. Invoking Yugoslavia as a hybrid, as nešto is među, something in between, as the excellent film whose poster you can see there described it, or as Marina Blagojevic would argue, as a paradoxical, ambivalent semi-periphery, conveys very different things in the context of Yugoslav socialism than in what she terms the de-development and repatriarchalization involved in post-socialism. In a sense, this is a plea for relationality, of holding together both the multiple registers of modernity and the ways they are structured in dominance. Indeed, it's a plea for what Homi Bhabha has called eccentric knowledge, knowledge that is not from the center. Reinserting socialist Yugoslavia into a global historiography, remembering that knowledge of the globe and global knowledge are not the same thing at all, needs to perform, I think, a double movement. On the one hand, bringing Yugoslavia back into global social, political, economic and cultural relations, which I think the conference that was cancelled and a lot of recent work has tried to do, but also as the other part of the double movement, decentering its positionality, ensuring that other sites of analysis and struggle and the relations between them are taken into consideration. Research firmly rooted in the anti-colonial struggles of Africa, Asia, and Latin America is of vital importance in a reconsideration of the significance of non-alignment. Yet, in the words of rapper Rakim in my title, borrowed in a text by Paul Gilroy, it may not be so much a case of where you look from, but how you look at these relations that matters. So in the rest of the paper, I want to focus on three separable but interlinked themes in terms of navigating the challenges of decentering both socialist Yugoslavia and, to an extent, the non-aligned movement itself. Different nodes, different histories. The first theme relates to the non-aligned movement as a kind of prefigurative, multinodal network community, rather more than a traditional international organization. It follows from this, I think, that a perspective that privileges one node at the expense of others, notwithstanding the fact that I do think there was what I've termed Yugoslavia as liminal hegemony of the movement for a certain time. If you privilege one node at the expense of others, you will inevitably have a distorted and incomplete analysis. Epistemological questions abound, however, in terms of which nodes may be more significant than others. Even in the Belgrade Summit of 1961, there were 25 participating states and 3 observers. There are also issues about how to understand the formal and informal relations and power dynamics between the nodes and between the nodes separately and together and the superpowers of the United States, Soviet Union, and China. Clearly, the totality of social relations within and beyond the network cannot be grasped by one researcher or even a large research team. We might choose to think about primary nodes, varying in different conjunctures. We might say that India, Yugoslavia, Indonesia, Cuba, Egypt, or the United Arab Republic Algeria, Ghana, Libya, and Tunisia were key participants, key nodes at different times. But I think even here, the nature of the networks to be studied, including their differential intensities and variegated trajectories, will depend upon the theme. They'll be radically different from conjuncture to conjuncture and can't be known fully in advance. So, you know, you start a research project which is about 3 of the nodes, and then you find that there are other nodes that you really can't ignore. Just to illustrate, I've been wading through texts that focus on India's role in the non-aligned movement. Much of it concentrates on the first post-independence Prime Minister of India, Nehru, who died in 1964. You might think this is just another example of the great men theory of history, but it can also be understood, I think, within critical social science as a focus on agency, significant individual or collective action, always taking place in a complex interaction with structures, macro-level constraints and opportunities, institutions, sets of governing routines and practices, and discourses, sets of intersubjective meanings, an acid framework, agency, structure, institutions, and discourses, according to Mullert and Jessup. While Raymond Williams refers to homology primarily in terms of structures, one could argue for an agentic homology in terms of Nehru and Tito. Consider this extract from a book. I've got it somewhere, and I can't find it. Here it is. Get it out. There you go. War and Peace in Modern India, Strategic History of the Nehru Years. It's looking at Nehru's foreign policy and strategic decision-making in key conflicts. Here's the quote. Amongst his most striking contribution was the attempt to fashion a distinctive international personality, resisting the seductions of both sides in the Cold War. India wanting to steer its own course, wanting a world order based on reason and persuasion, playing a prominent role in creating what the author wrongly calls the non-aligned bloc, because they, of course, wanted not to be seen as a bloc, pushing for a ban on nuclear tests, mediating conflicts, and so on, so that the biographer could say Nehru is amongst the leading statesmen of the 20th century. Well, I think you can connect that with Tito. Interestingly, Nero's marked reluctance to combine his principled commitment to non-alignment, predating that of Tito, with any formalizing of it within an international institution is well known. Equally clear is India's need for a broader international support during its border dispute with China, resulting in something of a propaganda blitz in 1960 through its ambassadors across the world, including in Yugoslavia. Okay, so I've become Yugocentric to criticize Yugocentrism. But the last time I was in the Yugoslav archives, Archive Yugoslavia, I found details of at least 15 meetings between the Indian ambassador to Yugoslavia and Yugoslav leaders, including Foreign Minister Kocha Popovic, his deputies Sergej Prica and Veljko Micunovic, diplomat Bogdan Crnobrnja, and others. All of this before the start of the 15th UN General Assembly in New York. Not unlike the famous Briuni meeting between Tito, Nasser, and Nehru in July 1956, a picture of real uncertainty on how to move forward is apparent. Nehru's attendance at the Belgrade summit was in doubt until the very last moment, insisting on guarantees from the Yugoslavs that this was going to be a one-off event. What's also clear is that the supportive stance towards the movement from Nero's daughter, Indira Gandhi, during her decade as Prime Minister between 1966 and 1977 was really important. So what we need to do, I think, as this illustrates, is triangulate archival sources, reviewing literature with a non-Yugoslav focus and working with researchers in other key NAM states. The second theme I want to address is the relationship and the maneuverings between the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference of April 1955 and the Belgrade Non-Aligned Summit of September 1961. In February, I attended a workshop of critical social policy scholars in The Hague, many of whom were working from or on the Global South, who were making frequent reference to the Bandung spirit, Bandung humanism, whereas my references to the non-aligned movement were treated with a degree of skepticism. I was alerted to a special issue of the Inter-Asian Cultural Studies Journal from 2016, focused on 60 years after Bandung. It's there on the slide, with essays from Samir Amin and notable social policy scholars, including Roberto Bisio and Jomo KS, in which non-alignment was either bypassed, the role of Yugoslavia ignored, or even the radicalism of Bandung was contrasted with the conservatism of the non-aligned movement. A couple of days later, at an event on multilateralism in Berlin, I was introduced by, I think, someone from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung as follows. And now Paul will focus on the role of the non-aligned movement, which began in Bandung in 1955. So you've got the elision of the two, or the total separation of the two. My point here is that there's no little confusion and a lot of contention regarding the relationship between Bandung, Belgrade, and non-alignment. Certainly, a non-Yugocentric focus on Bandung is both desirable and realistic, not least because Socialist Yugoslavia was not a participating state. It sent two observers, Juraj Gustuncic and Jože Šmole, who, whilst formerly journalists, reported back very much on political lines, drawing encouragement from the holding, quotes, of the first large international meeting that in practice confirmed the possibility of anti-bloc politics. As Aida Hodžić reminds us, Tito's wife, Jovanka Broz, in her memoirs, falsely places herself in Bandung, falsely places herself sitting between Tito and Nehru, in fact, and claims credit for putting the idea of the non-aligned movement into their head. My sense now is that scholars of global Yugoslavia need to treat Bandung on its own terms, rather than merely accepting Svetozar Rajak's argument that Yugoslavia succeeded compared to Bandung in making NAM more truly global. It's an argument that I was pushing for a while. After all, Yugoslavia and Cyprus were the only European participants. Latin American countries joined later and in rather smaller numbers because of pressure from the US. He also argues that Belgrade and the non-aligned movement transformed it into a movement compared to Bandung. But we need to bear in mind here that it was not really a formalized movement until the Lusaka summit in 1970, and even then, it was the Yugoslavs who remained opposed to a permanent secretariat. Certainly the failure, often a result of Chinese positions, to ever hold a Bandung II, created the space for the non-aligned movement to take the spirit of Bandung forward, not least in terms of its anti-colonial discourse, amplifying an anti-bloc politics whilst perhaps blunting its racialized radicalism. Well, that again would need another paper. An interesting similarity between Bandung and Belgrade is the performative or iconographic status as early international media events, to quote Jürgen Dinkel, treating politics as a kind of symbolic theatre. At the same time, it's very important to contrast Bandung as a symbol of the awakening of post-colonial Africa and Asia, and a deliberate attempt to position post-colonial elites and publics as having an identity of interest, with the Belgrade Summit's presentation of Yugoslav modernity and hand of friendship to nations emerging from colonialism. Comparing and contrasting the aesthetics of Bandung and Belgrade may be a fruitful avenue for research, not least in terms of Branislav Jakovlevic's designation in his book Alienation Effects, shown on the slide, of socialist Yugoslavia as a performance state. Yugoslavia's stance on other international meetings and movements, whether they came to fruition or not, be it the Afro-Asian Conference, the Islamic Conference, the Pan-African Congress, or the ill-fated Conference of New Emerging Forces that Sukarno tried to organize, at least suggests the need for these diverse movements to be examined on their own terms and in relation to each other. So let me go to the third theme, developmentalism in flux and the relationship between non-aligned movement and the G77. They are overlapping groupings in terms of membership and objectives, and they had a form of strategic differentiation, not least in terms of formal status within the United Nations. The Berlin event that I attended in February. The first question or other statement was from a woman in her 70s who started with those dreaded words for anyone dealing in history. I was there. She went on to suggest that G77 was crucial in challenging the hegemony of the superpowers and not the non-aligned movement that most of the time was as quiet as a mouse. It turns out she was part of the diplomatic mission of the DDR to the United Nations. And so it might look like that from that positionality, given that the G77 was registered as a UN body, but that the non-aligned movement was not. But there's much more to be said here. And part of it is that without UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, there would have been no G77, or at least not a G77 formed at the end of the first UNCTAD. Arguably, without the Belgrade Summit, and crucially, the Economic Conference of Non-Aligned States in Cairo in July 1962, there may well have been no UNCTAD either. And then we need to look, I think, at the relationship between UNCTAD and the new international economic order. The greater focus on North-South relations and on economic questions throughout the 70s is, I think, one of the main reasons for the increasing importance of the non-aligned movement in this period. But this was always in close coordination with the G77. UN bureaucracy assigned socialist Yugoslavia to work and be in competition for executive positions with African and Asian countries in the preparation phase of UNCTAD, repeated over a decade later in the Paris Conference on International Economic Cooperation. This, I think, made Yugoslavia very aware of its obligations to the Global South, but and this was amplified in the wake of the oil price shocks of the early 70s. It also understood its liminal position as neither part of the economic core nor the economic periphery. There's also the argument of Joanna Bockman about the complicated confluence between socialist and neoclassical globalization at the time. But let me conclude. The three themes I've noted here, there's another one that's very obvious, the role of the tricontinental, sorry, which I didn't have time to look at in this paper. The themes illustrate some of the challenges for a kind of critical post-colonial history or historical sociology of the period, going beyond Yugocentrism, but still retaining a nuanced concern with global Yugoslavia across different conjunctures. This might sound like the kind of advice you would give to every doctoral student, but the important thing here is to set out research questions clearly and carefully, to delineate the boundaries, but be willing to cross those boundaries. Methodological choices, I think, that support multi-sited, parasited, and meta-historiographies might represent significant ways forward. And I'm borrowing here very much from an anthropological methodology literature. Multi-sited ethnography, proposed quite a long time ago now by George Marcus, suggests the importance, quote, of multiple sites of observation and participation that cut across dichotomies such as the local and the global, the life world and the system. And this idea of a multi-sited historiography, if you want to call it that, seems to be easily transferable to the study of non-aligned movement. The second one, para-ethnography, was originally envisaged by Marcus and Holmes as referring to recursive and collaborative spaces of co-production between anthropologists and others with, quote, shared, discovered, and negotiated critical sensibilities. Parasited historiography opens up, I think, post-disciplinary approaches to the non-aligned movement, and borrowing from Michel Serres, it prioritizes reflections from our sources or interlocutors about the functioning of the systems and institutional routines in which they've been embedded, a choice very well suited to work on the non-aligned movement. Finally, meta-ethnography or meta-historiography here in my translation of it attempts to systematize through the development of heuristic models the interpretation of findings across multiple sites and studies, seeking to preserve the interpretive qualities of the original work whilst generating new insights regarding the system as a whole. In his book on Michel de Certeau, Ian Buchanan devotes a whole chapter to meta-historiography, allowing for the field of historical discourse to be treated as history itself treats myth and tradition, namely as an instrument of culture, not merely its record. So our work becomes part of the narrative and isn't a detached observation of the narrative. Extending this then finally to the study of the non-aligned movement, it's certainly useful to question what cultural needs our studies meet in ourselves, what the relationship is between the place or the institution or the movement, the analytical procedures utilized, and the text produced. For me, at least, it speaks to what Galkin, in his recent English version of a book that appeared originally in Slovenian, has described as a revolutionary rupture and a politics and practice of emancipation, remembering, reconstructing, and translating, quotes, all of these anti- and decolonial contributions of the second part of the 20th century that have been swept away in the age that allegedly ended history. A focus on socialist Yugoslavia is a necessary but far from sufficient part of this, I think. That's it. Thank you.